Today, I wanted to spend some time talking about what we're going to call high conflict people. And the reason I chose this topic is because oftentimes students will come to me and they'll be describing their boss or a coworker, usually someone in their work life. And they'll say to me, he or she is crazy. And I mean like really crazy. Now, sometimes that's an exaggeration, but sometimes there's some truth to that assessment. And that is because about 10% of the population struggles with some kind of personality disorder. We're going to take a look at 5 of those personality disorders today. So, studies show that about 10% of the population have one or more of the following personality disorders: borderline personality disorder, narcissistic, antisocial, histrionic, and paranoid. And about 10 to 15% additional members of the population have some traits of these types of disorders. Maybe not the full disorder, but some of the similar traits. We're going to take a look at each type of disorder and discuss what some of the common symptoms are and what is the underlying cause of the disorder. People with borderline personality disorder have an unconscious and extreme fear of being abandoned. And it's that fear of being abandoned that leads them to be very clingy and sometimes going into rages. I know a lot of you have probably encountered these kinds of people in your personal life. Right? Someone who you thought was going to be a friend and then just never leaves you alone. Right? Suspicious about where you're going and who you're going out with. That kind of clinging and raging behavior. The irony about that type of behavior is that it tends to push people away. And so the people do abandon them. So the way that they behave themselves feeds into their greatest fear. People who are narcissistic have an unconscious and extreme fear of being inferior or helpless. And the way that they behave is to present themselves as being superior to others and to constantly insult and demean others, which makes them feel more important and superior. There are some who say that our president is a narcissist by pointing to the fact of how he treats people who dare to criticize what he does. He insults and demeans them on Twitter. And again, this behavior, insulting and demeaning others to make themselves feel better about themselves, tends to push those people to insult them and to view them as inferior. Again, their behavior feeding into their fears. People who are antisocial, they have an unconscious and extreme fear of being dominated by others. So this presents itself with dominating, manipulating, deceiving, and oftentimes harmful behavior. Antisocial people seem to lack empathy and impulse control. They don't tend to show remorse. They don't tend to accept responsibility for their behavior. And sometimes they strike out with harmful behavior, which oftentimes will lead them into legal trouble and getting incarcerated. Histrionic behavior. People who are histrionic have an unconscious and extreme fear of being ignored. So they always want to be the center of attention. And this causes them to present dramatic and intense behaviors. And once again, oftentimes the consequence of this dramatic and intense behavior is people tend to try to ignore them. Again, feeding into their fear. Finally, we have people who are paranoid. People who are paranoid have an unconscious and extreme fear of being betrayed by those close to them. They assume there are all sorts of plots and conspiracies out there, and they hold grudges and attack others first in order to try to protect themselves. When we are involved with people who either have one of these personality disorders or have some of the traits of these personality disorders, we have to treat them differently. It is often our human instinct when dealing with this type of behavior that we want to point out why their behavior is wrong. We give them negative feedback in an attempt to change their behavior, but giving them negative feedback is actually the worst thing that we can do. The underlying problem with people with high conflict disorders is that they have what is called a mistaken assessment of danger. They believe people are out to get them. They believe people are going to abandon them. They believe they're not going to get enough attention. Right? It's mistaken, but that's what they believe. And their mistaken assessment of danger creates behavior in them that is aggressively defensive. So the acronyms of MAD, mistaken assessment of danger, and BAD, behavior that is aggressively defensive. MAD drives their BAD. And negative feedback generally backfires with these high conflict people because it just feeds into their mistaken assessment of danger. So when we encounter these people, either in trying to resolve conflicts with them or trying to engage in a negotiation with them, when we start to see some of these traits, we have to change our behavior. First of all, and most importantly, we have to reduce their mistaken assessment of danger. We have to try to interact with them in a way that's not emotionally threatening to them. And that means when we recognize some of these traits, we need to try to respond to the traits in an affirmative manner rather than a negative manner. This is sometimes really hard to do. The kind of affirmative behavior is when you run into a narcissist, you have to pay that person a compliment rather than letting them see you as someone who's going to demean them or make them feel inferior. When you run into someone who always has to be the center of attention and who might be a histrionic, you have to pay some attention to them. Not make them the center of attention, but rather than push them away, pay some attention to them. This is sometimes really hard to do because these people can be really irritating, and it takes some overcoming the instinct not wanting to play into their unreasonable behavior. But if we're going to deal with them affirmatively and try to get past their typical means of behavior, that is what you have to do. The second thing to do to try to deal with high conflict people is that we need to set limits on their behavior that is aggressively defensive. So we have to respond to them in some kind of affirmative manner. We show empathy and concern. We try to give them a little compliment. We try to pay them some attention. But we have to explain that if they continue with their behavior, it's not going to get them the result that they want. And to explain to them that if they engage in other behavior, it will be more effective in the long run at getting them what they want, whether it be respect or attention. If you really want people to respect you, it probably would be better if you didn't criticize them all the time. Things like that, to point out other ways they can go about getting what they really want and what they really feel that they need. And finally, 3, try to avoid giving high conflict people negative feedback. As I said, that only feeds into their mistaken assessment of danger. And again, this is something that's hard to do because our natural instinct is want to correct their behavior and point out why it's wrong. And I'm just as guilty of this as other people are. How often have we said something like, "Don't be so dramatic," or "No one's out to get you," or "You're not as smart as you think," or "Why is it always somebody else's fault?" Those are things that I recognize in myself that I have said to people in the past. As I say, it's frustrating to deal with high conflict people, and our natural instinct is to want to point out that their thinking is wrong. But if they truly are someone with some of these personality disorders, that is not an effective way to deal with them. And it's not an effective way to resolve conflicts with them, and it's not an effective way to conduct a negotiation with them. So, these people will always present challenges. It's not like there's a perfect way to deal with someone with a personality disorder. However, if you follow these 3 steps, it will make dealing with them a little bit more productive and a little bit more easy.